Welcome to On the Level, broadcasting from the Blue Ocean Network studios here in Beijing. My name is Fergus Thompson. The Royal Asiatic Society has had a long and eventful history in China. First established in 1858, it operated here until 1952, when certain political events led to a almost or over 50-year hiatus in its activities. But times change, as do perceptions and organisations, and in 2007, the first Royal Asiatic Society in New China was established. That was followed sometime later, very recently in fact last year, by the Royal Asiatic Society in China Beijing Chapter. Well, the gentleman behind this latter phoenix rising from the ashes is my guest for On the Level today, Alan Babington-Smith, polyglot banker, leadership coach, reciter of Homer and promoter of exchanges between China and the rest of the world. Alan Babington-Smith, welcome to On the Level.
Thank you very much. What fun being here.
Now, perhaps before we look at the Royal Asia Society and your particular interest here, the Royal Asia Society in Beijing, maybe a little bit of personal background. What brought an English banker to China? And you've been here now for well over a decade.
Right. I laughingly say to some people, I've been here all this century, because I arrived in January 2000.
It is. Technically, it's true.
Technically, it's true, yeah. Well, I was a fairly conventional banker for most of my earlier working life. But when the Berlin Wall came down, I thought that was going to be the biggest development in my lifetime. So I went over into Eastern Europe and set up banks and other financial organizations in those countries, including Russia. And towards the end of the 1990s, I was asked to do something similar in China. It's extraordinary to think now that as recently as that, 15 years ago, China thought it could use outside advice on something like setting up some banks. So anyway, I arrived in January 2000 to work in Liaoning province for 3 years, setting up some quasi-banks called credit guarantee funds.
That is a business side of you, at one facet of it. But part of during your stay here, at one stage you ended up reciting or certainly quoting from Homer on the Great Wall. How did that come about, that more cultural side of it?
Yeah, well, I was very lucky to run into some people who were setting up TEDx here in Beijing and a marvelous place called Jinshanling on the Great Wall. And they looked for people who had a peculiar but special interest they're enthusiastic about. And I happen to love Homer. As you say, I'm one of the few people who actually can speak Homer. And so they asked me to give a talk about Homer, and that involved some recitation and some talk about what Homer is about.
The other side of your persona here then is this very important one, which is the Royal Asia Society in China, the Beijing branch of it. But the Royal Asiatic, I should say, the Royal Asiatic Society. What is the history of this organisation? How far back does it go, and where does the China side of it fit in? Well,
it goes back a very long way. It goes back, in fact, towards the end of the 18th century, when it was actually founded in India in the 1780s. And a couple of generations later, it was set up more in a more established way in London in 1820. And then, as you said in your introduction, it came to Shanghai in the middle of the 19th century. It briefly operated in Hong Kong in the 19th century, but I think people in Hong Kong, as now, were probably much more interested in trade than the sort of cultural issues of the Royal Asiatic Society was interested in.
So what was the purpose of it at that stage when it was set up, say back in the earlier mid-19th century?
It was to help educate people about Asia, and particularly to help educate Europe, and Britain particularly, about Asia. And of course, in those days, particularly about India and what we now call the Middle East, I mean, Afghanistan and those sort of places.
And the branch that was set up in China, as you mentioned, in the 1850s, ran for almost a century. Things changed for the last half, obviously, with New China and the Communist Party and coming to power and so on. But things have done another circle now, and 2007 or something, it emerges again in Shanghai. Were you involved in that?
Not at all. There were some people I didn't know who actually set it up a couple of years earlier in Suzhou, but they then moved to Shanghai, and they then set it up in a serious way there. And as you said, that's now been going 7 years. It's got a big membership, a couple hundred people.
Right. So what inspired you to say, OK, they've got one going there in Shanghai, everything's very nice, this is the new chapter of the history of this organization in China, we're now going to set one up in Beijing. What was behind that? Had you contact with the society before?
None at all. It was a fellow asked me at a bar.
The beginning of many great enterprises.
Yeah, exactly. And it seemed too good to be true. I had nothing to do with it. I'd never actually heard of the Royal Asiatic Society before, but it sounded like the fulfillment of all sorts of things that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm. Just a little question that I had about the title. We have the adjective Asiatic, the Royal Asiatic Society. Does it give us sort of a touch of a colonial atmosphere to it? It was set up in colonial times.
Of course it was. I don't think it's now colonial so much as slightly antique, and that isn't altogether a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were talking recently to an American publishing house, and they said, Royal Asiatic, wow, that's got a good ring to it. So I think, it still has some interesting connotations.
Right. And certainly the word that would have been used at that particular stage back then when it was set up. Bringing China and the world together, is that the slogan of the society, or is that the slogan of your branch
in Beijing? It's particularly the slogan of the chapter in Beijing,
right.
But I think it does apply to what all the chapter in Shanghai certainly wants to do as well.
Right. So what is that? What if you were to say these are the goals, the aspirations of both the Royal Asiatic Society in China and particularly in Beijing, what would you say they are?
It's to stop China and the West talking past each other. Mm-hmm. I think that the peaceful rise of China and the understanding, increase of mutual understanding between China and the rest of the world is the big issue that in Asia that we want to try to deal with for the peace of the world. How are China and the world going to come to terms with each other? This huge developing country that is now close to being the world's largest economy, how is the world going to absorb it? How is it going to absorb the rest of the world? And I've seen in so many different times and places, there are fundamental cultural misunderstandings, usually based back on differences of culture and of values, that make all the detail go wrong. And if we can help in some tiny way just take the stones out of the shoes when people are walking, that's something useful to do.
So looking at the if you like, the stones in the shoes, as you say, these misunderstandings, how do you actually go about that? What sort of events or what does the society actually do on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis?
Sure. Well, we're a very small organisation. We're just starting. We have tried to organise about one event a month. I mean, over the last 18 months, we've held some 25 events, so it's about one a month. And we try to pick topics that exemplify cultural misunderstanding and to have a Chinese and a Western interlocutor discuss these issues, just to see if we can tease out whether there is more common ground than first appears, or whether there is, or at least identify what the differences of understanding are, so then you can deal with them.
You mentioned having interlocutors from both cultures or communities, both Chinese and abroad.
Yeah.
Are these people who are organising all these talks and so on? Are they volunteers? Is there a profit from the society? Where does it fit into in the business world?
It has no real business connection. It is a non-profit operating on a shoestring, dependent entirely on volunteers. We do charge a small membership fee to cover the cost of setting up a computer network or something like that, but basically it's very, very low-key, very low expense.
Who do you get? Where do your members come from?
Sure.
What is the typical, if there is one, or perhaps there isn't?
Yeah, well, we're starting out with about 60 members now after a year, and they're all different sorts of expats from a wide range of countries and backgrounds and occupations and ages, a real cross-section of the expat community. We encourage Chinese to get involved with our activities. As I'm sure you know, under Chinese law, Chinese passport holders can't become members of foreign associations.
I did see that on the website. It said yes, according to the present law. How do you get around that?
Well, we invite them to come along and take part, and to make them as welcome as we can.
Right. And so is there some sort of
we can't give them an official. We call them associates. We can't give it an official status, but it seems to work very well that a few will come along, and we hope, of course, that there is a huge now community of Chinese passport holders who are PRC citizens in every sense, who have huge experience abroad and have now come back.
Right.
Any number of who have been to American or Western or European universities, for example, who are now back in China.
Right.
And we're hoping to engage those. That I think will be a fascinating collection of people to get involved with.
So this is a small legal technical hurdle, but
Yeah,
essentially you're welcoming people to become members in all but name.
And for as far as China is concerned, we're way below any radar screen of we avoid any sensitive subjects. We don't discuss politics or economics. We just deal with cultural issues. Mm-hmm. And that's our niche.
You mentioned that you had Chinese speakers and,
yes.
and overseas speakers. Where do you get these speakers when you're organising events? Where do you source them from, as they say?
Yeah, an extraordinary range of connections and contacts. They come in almost at random. And there's no pattern of somebody just says, oh, by the way, I was at a meeting the other day with XYZ. He's the sort of fellow who I think would be interested to come and talk to you. And so we get, and it happens.
As happens in China, personal recommendation
totally.
Is the way to go.
Yeah.
The British ambassador, Sebastian Wood, is currently your patron
Indeed.
here in Beijing.
Yeah.
Does that mean that there's a special affinity, apart from the fact that the Royal Asiatic Society was set up in Britain, with Britain and the British government, and is it sort of more Britons involved rather than Americans or Chileans or French people?
Well, it has started out as that, as I am a Brit. I think of course, apart from the fact that I think Sebastian Wood is a splendid person and he's a kind friend.
Well, you'd have to say that he's your patron.
he is the closest representative to our official patron, who is the Prince of Wales.
I see. The Prince of Wales is the patron
of the Royal Asiatic Society in London.
I see. Right.
So, as far as I'm concerned, the British ambassador is the closest equivalent.
The representative.
So he's his representative, exactly.
And
so
that must also be helpful for you as a society to have somebody within the diplomatic circle who is able to perhaps
one day it might be. We haven't had to sort of take advantage of that yet. But he's been a wise advisor. He's been a wise advisor and guide on various things. Yeah.
You have said that there's a lot of you really are concentrating on the cultural side and the cultural links and sometimes perhaps misperceptions or misunderstandings between China and other parts of the world. You said you don't touch on politics, economics, and I believe one of your board members, Jörg Wuttke, actually happens to be the head of the European Chamber of Commerce at the moment. Could people use this as a sort of a business linking activity? Is that
absolutely not?
It's not.
No, we're deliberately avoiding business. The only, as you quite rightly pointed out, our board does include a previous chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce too, and a pretty prominent Chinese businessman. So those business people are involved, but they're interested because they realise that in their doing business, it's the cultural backgrounds that are the obstacles.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
A business person always says, "What's in it for me?" before they do anything. So, what is in it for these businesses and the people who are joining?
I think for a lot of almost all the members are business people, and they join because it's a relief from business. That we're not talking about business. They go to endless talks about tax issues and whatever. They don't want that. They want to get something to refresh their brains in an interesting way. Mm-hmm. The people who are on our board and helping us are there because they are extremely experienced in navigating the waters in China, and occasionally they can give us a steer of something we should or shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. And they happen to be all good friends, so that was the background to that.
You did say that this organisation is relatively new here in Beijing, but you have already organised several events, and we're not just talking about lectures here, are we? What are the other sort of activities that you organise?
Well, very crudely, we say, walks and talks.
Simply?
Very simply. So the walks have included, literally, walks, a very interesting and special tour of the Forbidden City, with a special angle to it, for example. Mm-hmm. So we don't just take people to the obvious places and tell them it's so many cubic meters in this room. We actually take them round with a very experienced guide who can tell them this is where such and such happened, and this is how so-and-so lived, and so on.
A visit somewhere, and also then these lectures about a particular topic linked together, perhaps?
Yeah. And we took some people to a Buddhist monastery to spend the night there, so they could understand really how Buddhism works.
Well, just to give an idea of the eclectic range of things that you've covered, I had a look earlier today at some of the past events over this year. You've been going a little over a year, ranging from preservation of old Beijing, history of the Hutongs, business society, business ethics, food on the noodle, Beijing to Rome. Again, it's something that reflects your life. You have a background in the classics, and then you're here in Beijing at the moment.
This was the great Marco Polo question.
Right. Did he bring the noodles or not?
Yeah.
What was the answer?
The book doesn't answer the question. it's still an open question. Still an open question. Yeah. But that was what that was about. And along the lines of food, we've had another session since on tasting pu'er tea.
This is a tea from the southwest of China,
exactly,
which has a whole history of how it's made and how it's drunk.
And interestingly, is a viper's nest of forgery and fake and misnaming and everything else. So it's an interesting side of China.
Right. So you're not just essentially talking about food or drink on these occasions, but how they play out
how it evolves
in Chinese society,
and how it works in Chinese society, and how different the tea market is in China from in the West.
And then literature, of course, very well-known Chinese author Lao She.
Sure. Yes, he lived in London for about 10 years and taught at SOAS, the big university teaching about Asian studies, and wrote a couple of novels while he was in England. That, in fact, was one of a series of small books that the Royal Asiatic Society of China produces, and this is another. This is about a couple called Xiong, who came to England and produced... A Chinese couple. And they produced in the 1930s a play in London, which was a kind of pastiche of Chinese opera. And it became the hit performance. And it ran for about 3 years in London. And the couple who organised it were based at Oxford. He was a sort of unofficial academic attached to Oxford. And they stayed on in England, and they became known as the Happy Xiong's, and they were sort of a parallel embassy, so to speak. For
why were they happy? Because of the royalties?
Well, this was the irony, that they projected this image of being the Happy Xiong's, but in point of fact, they were really rather unhappy, both as a couple, between the man and the wife, and with their situation in England. So it's rather a tragic story in a way. But it was a very interesting commentary on how China was perceived in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. Right. And so that was the interest of the story.
It must also have been interesting in comparing, at that stage, Chinese people who were travelling to Britain with so many Chinese people travelling to Britain and to other countries now. Many, of course, to study, but many also staying there and making new lives.
Yeah, and well, let's say that some are happier than the Xiong's.
I'm sure most of them are. I just see you have another book there. That's the Royal Asiatic.
This is our official journal. This is the one produced in China.
I see. Okay, so talking about the members that you have. The benefits that they have if they join this. Sure. This is produced every year?
This is indeed what they get as a physical bonus. But I think that the real bonus for most people is just intellectual stimulation. Amusing, entertaining stimulation. I think that's what it is in every sort of different direction. And some people join because they have a very specific interest. Other people join because they just have a huge range of interest. They don't know what they might be interested in. Somebody might say, gosh, I don't know anything about Chinese maps. I'll come along.
Well, maps, so you mentioned antique maps of Asia and China, hidden treasures, a talk that was organised by your organisation. Now, given the way that maps are playing out in the South China Seas at the moment and so much in the news, sort of a happy coincidence, these antique maps are they any of the ones that are involved? Because we see countries like China, the Philippines and Vietnam pulling maps out of dusty shelves from the 1930s.
Well, it was a very topical issue, and that came up. But the whole purpose of cartography was, one of the big issues that is the difference between China and the rest of the world for most of history. China wasn't interested in producing what the West would call physically accurate maps. The Western map makers just wanted to produce an accurate map of the world that was really accurate and showed everything correctly. The Chinese are much more interested in making a political point out of the map still. Almost all old Chinese maps do that. They try to show China as bigger than anywhere else around and so on.
I think this gives a clear idea of the breadth of topics and issues that you cover in these, whether it happens to be a trip or a talk by an expert. You've got a couple coming up, I think, which it also illustrates this, going from connecting man and heavens. I don't know whether that's philosophical or scientific. And then the other one is to do with the Yuan, a historical site here.
Summer Palace.
Yes, that's coming up in October. I'll just give the title. It's Imperial Splendor and a Life in Ruins, Yuan as a site of Chinese-European encounters. Now, that's interesting because as you talk about people talking past each other, but this is definitely a touchy subject for Chinese people because you can explain briefly why, perhaps.
Yeah, it was the most flagrant case of the West bursting in on China. There's no question about that.
Kicking down the door.
Kicking down the door, absolutely. And the only possible saving grace to the whole idea of Britain and America and France bursting into China was that if there weren't some kind of treaty made, China was going to be dismembered. And the West was very keen that China should remain as intact as it could. And if there weren't treaties made that brought China into the world as an equal, then there was a real worry that other powers would come in and just simply dismember the country. So when China talks about the 1.5 centuries humiliation, I entirely identify with that. But the alternative might have been far worse.
Would you just maybe perhaps explain for people who aren't familiar with this, that this was a joint force, British and French, it was essentially a punitive expedition, and they went to what was then these very elaborate gardens at Summer Palace in Beijing and torched it, razed it to the ground, and also took a lot of the very, very valuable stuff that's there. And today Chinese people will visit this site and the ruins are still there, as you can see. So how does that talk, which would seem to bring up a subject that both sides might like to forget, work as introducing Chinese and English thoughts on this together?
Well, it's interesting that on the 150th anniversary of this event just four years ago, China itself tried to play it down as a case of Western aggression. I mean, the West was slightly concerned that China would raise this subject and have huge, 3,000 people discussions about how savage the West was. And not a bit of it. China took the line, how can we make sure that China is so strong that this can never happen again? So they themselves are slightly playing it down as an issue of destruction. Of course, at the time, what Elgin particularly wanted to achieve was something that would force the occupying Manchus to make a treaty without damaging the Chinese people. And any kind of financial punishment would, of course, ended up in taxing on people, so that was no good. So and the Yuan was entirely the private garden of the occupying Manchus. No Chinese person had hardly ever been in it. So, of course, it's true that Britain and France went in and sacked it, but only after they'd tried to take out everything that they thought was valuable and keep it safe. And also in punishment for what they'd seen as totally unforgivable execution of people on a diplomatic mission.
So but many of the treasures and artifacts of this palace did disappear at the time. There were stories at the time of soldiers running home with Ming vases and so on. You mentioned Elgin there. You have a personal connection in that he's one of
the family connection. He's an ancestor.
He's an ancestor of yours, a direct ancestor.
Absolutely.
Of yours. Most people know of Elgin and consider that connected with the marbles in Greece that are taken to the British Museum. And there's been some friction between Britain and Greece about whether those should go back to Greece. And this whole discussion of patrimony as what were poorer, weaker countries become more powerful, and China would be an example, that this patrimony perhaps now should leave museums and go back to its original setting. What are your thoughts on that, having such an interesting family connection to it?
Well, I think you're quite right. This whole issue of restitution, as it's called, is a huge issue, and there's a huge range of views, and everybody is very passionate about their own point of view.
Specifically, the Summer Palace had these bronze animal heads, which have become a focus whenever they come up for auction in Christie's or Sotheby's or something. And there's a very nationalist feeling that these must be brought back to China or should be given back free in the best of circumstances.
Yep. China, I think, is moving against restitution because it recognizes that you open up a complete can of worms once you start doing Pandora's box. The case of the Elgin marbles, of course, is the most sensitive and so on. But it's only the first of. If you start with that issue, you
end up with no museums.
No museums, and I think it was very interesting that just about a year and a half ago, the museum at Olympias, which is where the Olympics started in the Peloponnese, was broken into and things were stolen. And the director of the museum there said, this is a tragedy for the world. This is a world museum. He didn't say, this is a tragedy for Greece, it's a Greek museum. So, and there are in every case almost of restitution, there are very specific issues. The Louvre, of course, will be emptied because almost everything in the Louvre was stolen by Napoleon from somebody. So I think that there is a general
and then stolen in turn by the Nazis, and then stolen in turn by the Russians.
Exactly. So, where do you stop?
So you feel that there may be cases, do you feel that maybe particularly sensitive cases, for example, in the case of China, these particular bronzes are something that comes up, would it just be, they are in private hands, many of them, but if they were in public hands, would there be a case for saying, okay, look, let's just send these back and
there's a case for it in some, maybe I don't know enough about those particular objects. I think they're absolutely hideous. And there are a lot of people who very much doubt that they actually came from the original Summer Palace, because there's no drawing of them in the Summer Palace in situ. They are so out of character with anything that was made in the 18th century in China that some people wonder whether they really ever did.
So there were also suggestions that they were actually manufactured or designed by Jesuits who were here.
Well, of course, if they were anything, all that bit of the Summer Palace where they allegedly was. So that's another layer of the argument.
You have, in your more professional life, you're involved in education. You are a graduate, well, you from Eton and later from Cambridge, I believe it was.
Correct, yeah.
You will wander around the streets of Shanghai and Beijing and see the Eton kindergarten, the Harrow private school, the Cambridge, etc., etc. Just going away from our core subject here, you're just going away from the Royal Society for a moment. As an educationist and somebody passionate about this, why do you feel that British education has such a hold on particularly the middle-class Chinese?
Okay. Can I just quickly on the subject of Eton, so to speak, you can buy Eton socks or something all over the world. So Eton has long since given up trying to protect its name.
Right. It can't do what the abbot in the Shaolin Temple has done and sort of forcefully, aggressively put down its brand.
Much too late to try to do anything about that. There are Eton blocks of flats all over the place and so on. But in the more general sense, America, of course, is the high ideal for most Chinese of achievement. But Britain does have a huge appeal because it seemed to be gentler, softer, more polite, broader than the American education system. That seems to be the appeal.
Mm-hmm. And also the brand is something which is very important to many middle-class Chinese people who a generation ago, in some cases couldn't afford shoes, are now perfectly able to afford to send their children abroad to these places.
Yeah.
But brands are very important.
Brands are very important.
If you're going to send somebody, it's better to a public school or a university with a name that is known all over the world than perhaps an equally good one.
Yeah, I think there is brand is around, and the Great Britain brand is something that the Britain everywhere is trying to build up. Mm-hmm. It's very curious to me. Almost a lot of those little sort of scooters, like Vespa type scooters, have the Union Jack emblazoned on them as their decoration.
I have noticed this.
I have no idea where that came from.
Over the past year or so, whether it's a very successful promotional campaign by your compatriot in the British Embassy, or it's just simply the luck of
no
fashion.
Idea. It may be just the fashion. They have no idea what it is.
Yeah, it looks like, anyway, or else they're all fans of The Who.
Yeah, well, that's more likely, actually. It's done with a football club, more likely.
Alan Babington-Smith, I wish you many more years of bringing China and the rest of the world closer together. Thanks very much for coming on the line.
Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.